You take the blue pill, the story ends. You wake up in your bed and believe whatever you want to believe. You take the red pill, you stay in Wonderland, and I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes. That was a quote from the Matrix. That was the scene where Morpheus and Neo are are talking before Neo um, even enters um, into reality. Before he's still in the Matrix, and this is where Morpheus is explaining to him how his paradigm is about to shift if he takes the red pill. And I wanted to talk about start off talking about the Matrix because it's a it's a really good allegory to how your paradigm kind of shifts when you start getting your eyes and your ears and your mind and your heart open to the things that God shows you. And I'm actually going to take off this Neo outfit. Um, it's kind of hot, but yeah. Um, Again, I'm just kind of doing this because it's kind of funny, and I don't want to be completely serious all the time in these talks. I want it to be kind of humorous as well and fun. But yeah, we're talking about part four of how to study the Bible, and part four has to deal with paradigm shifts, changing your perspective, and how God kind of needs to change the way you see things um, in order to really learn um, what his world is like. Because we live in our world, which is like a three-dimensional world, right? God created, it talks about in Genesis how he created the earth. It was formless and void. He had to create light, separate light and darkness. He had to separate the waters above from below. He kind of had to build kind of like the earth is kind of like a apartment for us to dwell within the world of God, right? He made space for us so that we can have a place where we can exist, literally. He had to create all the laws of physics and biology and chemistry so that we could have this little place, and he had to create time so that we could live. And in a way, when we or when the Jewish people built the temple or the tent of meeting, they created a place for God to dwell when he was in their midst. And now that place is within our hearts. So it's kind of like, yeah, your paradigm has to shift even for that to realize what God created for us and what we get to create for him within our lives, right? He's a holy God. So we have to have lives that are holy so that he can dwell with us, dwell among us. Um, so yeah, that's a kind of a paradigm shift. Um, Another paradigm I want to talk about, the kingdom of God and studying the word, is kind of like a paleontologist. If you remember the movie Jurassic Park, they kind of opened up a scene with Sam Neill, and he's a paleontologist, and he's in North America in the United States. I think it was in Dakota, and he was digging in the earth for fossils, and he found like a raptor claw, and that's kind of what studying the Bible is like, or getting like a major lesson in the Bible. You kind of got to dig a little bit, and you might find a claw, and then you'll find bones of the hand, and then the arm, and before you know it, you've unearthed a dinosaur, like an old ancient teaching from God. Um, and it starts with just the claw, but then you find other things in the study when you're reading that ends up being more than just a claw. You find something that is not just a coincidence, but this thing relates to the other thing. Um, and an example I would say, a really good example of this is found with the story of Jacob when he leaves Laban. That's in Genesis 31. and it talks about how he gets up early. He takes all his children and his two wives and his two concubines or handmaids that helped Leah and Rachel, and he gathered all his livestock, everything he's earned, and he left before Laban can find out. But then when Laban gets up in the morning, he pursues them. He finds out they've left. He's upset. He pursues them, and he catches them. And then he proceeds to ask Jacob, why did he do this? Why did he sneak out? And he didn't get to kiss his grandchildren. He didn't get to say goodbye to his daughters. He's putting on this big dramatic show of how upset he is. And he even says that his gods, his idols, were taken. And so, if you've read the story and you know that it was Rachel who actually took the idols, and she was hiding it underneath her saddle where she was sitting. And so Laban, like as he's searching for them, he gets upset, and then Jacob gets upset, and so that's kind of like the two of them are fighting, right? Verbally, and voices are raised, and it gets to the point where Jacob just says, hey, in verse 32, Genesis 31, verse 32, and he says, but if you find your gods with someone, that person will not remain alive. So he's basically threatening to put to death the person who took the idols, not knowing that it was actually Rachel. He's kind of cursing that person, right? And so we find out later that, Laban does not find the idols because she's sitting on them. And she says that she's having her period, so it would be uncomfortable for her to get up and off of the saddle. And so Laban never finds his gods, his idols. And later on, we do know, hindsight, that she ends up dying on the way. That curse actually comes true. It's like a self-fulfilling prophecy that Jacob said, and she ends up dying on the road back, never making it back into the promised land. And so it's very interesting. It's like I was talking about fossils and finding a claw, right? And so if you read on into Exodus and you get to chapter 21, verses 22 through 25, there's a verse that says, if men strive and hurt a woman with child, so that her fruit departs from her, and yet no mischief follow, he shall be surely punished, according to the woman's husband, and will lay upon him, and he shall pay as the judges determine. And so this verse is pointing back, this law in Exodus is pointing back to the Jacob story. How is it pointing back to the Jacob story? Well, you got two men who are fighting, right? They're striving with each other, Jacob and Laban. And there's a woman who's struck, and you see later on that Rachel is the woman who was struck, and she ends up dying. Now, what about the child that goes forth? It doesn't say that child dies. It doesn't say in the scripture that some versions will say dies, and that's a misinterpretation. If in Hebrew it says go forth, that the child comes forth from the woman. It doesn't say it's a miscarriage. It just says that the child leaves the woman, right? And so you have this image of a child leaving the parent, right? And so there's a lesson to be learned. This is like a major thing of how like Jews study. You see, and how they unearth dinosaurs in the scriptures, and I'm showing you. You see the image of a child going forth as a result of two men fighting and striking the woman. Like, not physically always, but I mean, this law was created later to be for a woman who's actually literally physically struck, but it's also painting an image of a lesson to be learned, a valuable lesson, that when two men fight and a woman is struck, that a child ends up going forth. And some of the other coincidences, you could say, if you want to say it's a coincidence, the other parallels in the Bible are like where Abraham and what and what's his name? I was just about to say it. Abraham and and Lot are fighting, and then Lot ends up going forth, right, leaving them. A really good example is Esau and Jacob, right? They're both fighting, and then what happens is Jacob ends up going forth, leaving his father and his mother. And there's parallels as you look through a lot of the stories. Joseph is another example. The brothers were fighting with their dad. Joseph ends up going forth. So a child ends up going forth, leaving the parents, because of the result of two people fighting. You'll see lots of parallels to this, where if you actually open your heart to it and start studying and looking at, I would challenge you, look at like a lot of the stories in the Bible where two men two people are fighting, and then it ends up someone's struck, and the child ends up going forth from the parent. But it's not just a literal law in Exodus. It's actually kind of painting a picture, an image, or an allegory of lessons to learn when two people fight and someone else, another bystander, is collateral damage, and then the child ends up going forth as a result of it. It's kind of a warning so that you are very careful before you start engaging in a fight and there's a woman involved and there's children involved. So be wise in the way that you fight is kind of what it's showing. This example of teaching is midrashic form of teaching that has been taught from the time of Moses. Moses taught this kind of teaching to to Joshua. Joshua taught it to the judges, and the judges passed it on to the prophets, and then the prophets passed it on to the rabbis, and the rabbis continue this process today. It's a term called a trigger effect, where there's something in the text that Moses wrote, or that some of the other authors in the Bible have written into the text. It might seem like just a minor statement, but when you look at it, you realize that all the statements in the scriptures were there for a reason, to teach a lesson, a life lesson. So that's kind of like let's say you have a pistol, right? This is a fake plastic one, and then you got what's going to go into the chamber are the projectiles, right? So you load the projectile into the chamber, and you pull on the trigger, and there's a an explosion that sends the projectile forward to have an impact. And so scripture is orally taught in Jewish tradition and passed on. And within that teaching, there is always something. And in the scriptures, there's always a point to it. There's like a loaded projectile within the chamber. And when you pull on the trigger, it has an impact on your life. That's called the trigger effect, and you'll find stuff like that in all the stories of Genesis and Exodus, all of Moses' stories, even in the prophets and Solomon's writings. And even in the teachings of Yeshua, Jesus, he had lots of trigger effects because he spoke midrashically. He taught the oral tradition to his disciples, his Talmud, the disciples. But yeah, that's just one example. There's another thing that I want to kind of share because it's kind of like the Matrix, and it's kind of like the trigger effect. And there's a game I kind of play whenever I study, and I find a comparison contrast between several different things that, let's say, Moses is teaching. And in Deuteronomy chapter 20, for example, this is like his closing speech to Israel before he goes up to the mountain and he doesn't, and then before they enter the promised land. Chapter 20, he's talking about going into war. And when Israel's about to go to war, he says there's four types of people who don't have to go to war, four types of men. The first one is the man who builds a house and never gets to live in it. He hasn't lived in it yet. He says that person should go live in his house for a while and he should not go to war. And because it would be a shame if he died at war and was never able to fulfill his dream and live in the house, finish what he started. Second man was the man who builds a vineyard and has not partaken in its harvest and its fruit or its wine, right? That would be a shame for him to go to war and die without ever having harvested and tasted his wine. The third man is the man who is engaged to be married. And if he hasn't been married and hasn't lived with his wife, then he should not go to war either, because it would be shameful if he, dated and courted this woman, they fell in love, and then he died in war and never got to get married. And the last person, the fourth one, is the man who's a coward. Because why? Because a cowardice and fear is viral. It is contagious. And so it would be bad for that person to go in a war and infect other men around him so that they would all have fear and end up, dying in the war. So the game that I play is one of these things is not like the other. You got three different men who are all sent home because it would be a sad story if they died without fulfilling their lives, right? It's like, what was the point of them being born anyway, is kind of what the rabbis are saying, what Moses is saying. And so if their faith is in God, not so much in the men are just kind of holding God's hand through the process, through the battle. It would be shameful if they died, and not having fulfilled their purpose. But there's one other man. So the game of one of these things is not like the other. It's that coward, right? He's the one who's not like the other three. That's one of the examples that I use. It's like a lot of people will read this verse in Deuteronomy, and a lot of people will read a lot of the little stories within the different books of Moses, and they just glance over it and they don't get the lessons that are learned. I'm trying to shift your paradigm so that within every paragraph, I would say, and sometimes within like specific sentences, you'll find little things that were put into the text that are not meant to be overlooked, that teach a valuable lesson, right? Like this example in Deuteronomy 20 teaches a lesson of not just for war preparations, but of each person's life has value and has parts of things that have to be fulfilled, right? And it would be a shame. It would be almost like, why was this person alive? They couldn't fulfill what their purpose was, and that's a pretty important lesson that you could learn from this. And a lot of people would overlook that as they read through. There's tons of gems in the Bible like that. I think in the last video I did, part 3, I talked about rocks and diamonds. That's a paradigm shift, right? Thinking about the laws and all the little gems in the Bible. And if you think about what story or illustration they're trying to paint behind each law, reminding you of each of the people stories in Genesis that the law is based on, yeah, that's a paradigm shift. So what is a paradigm shift? I would say this. I have this example. You can see these three toothpicks on the table. And I challenge people many times to make six, four equilateral, which is equilateral triangles where all angles are the same, and or all angles are 60-degree angles, right? Equilateral, and all the sticks are used, and there's no extra triangles. It's just exactly four triangles, all equal sides, all equal angles. And I see people doing this, doing this, doing like a Star of David, but that's not an equilateral. You're getting like a hexagon in the middle, and they're not all equal, and you're getting more than four triangles. So it's got to be exactly four. And I let them play with it for a while. It's kind of a brain teaser until their paradigm is shift, and I show them something. So they're actually not just thinking 2D, but they're thinking 3D. And that's when you see a pyramid. Because a pyramid is basically you see four perfect triangles, right? That's a pyramid. And you don't always see it if you're thinking 2D. You'll never get it. And so your paradigm has to shift to a three-dimensional paradigm. Another paradigm I have is the example of an equation. I will say 5 plus 12 is equal to what? Most people will just say 17, right? That's basic algebra, right? Addition. You take 12, you add 5, that's 17. But I will say, no, 5 and 12 equals 13. And people look at me like I'm smoking something. And some people will look at me and say, what are you smoking? And then they'll also say, can I have some? But no, I'm not smoking anything. This is actually physics. This is actually called vector equations, where let's say you're going five steps north and 13 steps west. Your total distance is not the addition of 5 plus 12, but if you were to take the first point that you started with and go at a diagonal travel, and that diagonal distance is actually 13 because it's actually a triangle. I don't know if you can see this. It might be too bright. Let me take down the intensity of this. But a 5, 12, 13 triangle is basically if you draw a 5-inch long line going north, and then a 12-inch line going east. That diagonal from the original place, the origin, to the final end of the 12-inch line, that diagonal is 13 inches. But that also is a paradigm shift because you're not just doing basic algebra, you're doing vector equations. And like, kind of like those two examples of a paradigm shift, that's something that my friend Eliakim, he's one of the guys that I'm kind of discipling. I basically have like 12 guys right now in my life that I'm discipling. Eliakim, my friend Caleb, Alex, Andy, Abel, Hyro, Abraham, Adam, Corey, Colton, Gabe, and Jake. All those guys. Shout out to you guys. I've kind of been working with these 12 guys for the last 6 to 9 months and teaching them these things that I've learned. And they've had major paradigm shifts. I'm sharing with them all the time. In their mind, they look at me and they get like goosebumps on some of the things that I'm teaching them, and their mind is blown because they've read this stuff before, but they've never had their paradigm shifted to see things this way, and they're seeing the value of it. Yeah, the final paradigm shift I'd like to share with you is what's called MEPS. MEPS in architecture. It's mechanical drawings, electrical drawings, plumbing drawings, and structural drawings. Most people who think architecture, they just look at the outside, the facade, right? Or even when they go inside the house, they're looking at the drywall, the finished material, all the little decorations, the paint, the carpet, what your eyes can see. But that's kind of like, I was kind of had this revelation before when we were talking about church and the value of like people who do all the unseen things and the people who help prepare food, the people who vacuum and clean up, the people who bring the paper towels and the toilet paper, and all the people who are helping to make church possible, right? To make not church, but the service possible, right? They're doing all the unseen things, and they're very valuable people. People who pray for everybody. Um, those people are valuable. They're kind of like what in architecture we call MEPS, right? It's not the facade, it's not the drywall, it's not the paint, the carpet, the tile that's important for the house. Those things are pretty, but it's a facade. Um, the important things in the house that really make a house livable are the structure, the hidden framing, the floor, the TGIs, the ceiling joists, the roof trusses, because those things are what you actually stand on. That's what supports you. That's what you hold for structure and framing. They protect you from the shear forces and the things, earthquakes, all that. It's the structure. That's the S in MEPS. The electricity, that's what actually powers your house. That's what gives you the ability to run your air conditioning system, your refrigerants, your all that stuff. Your gas lines are hidden. That's what gives you heat. The water lines, the plumbing, that's the P, right? That's what gives you water. It keeps you alive. It refreshes you. It washes everything. It cleanses you. It takes away, the plumbing is what takes away the waste, those things that made you dirty. So it actually helps remove the things from your life that are unclean, right? Things that are not kosher. And then you also have the mechanical, which is the M, and that's what gives you air. It heats, cools, conditions your life, makes it comfortable. Kind of like the kindness of God, the Hesed of Abraham. It's what gives you breath, right? Like God breathed. Those are the four important things for a house. And yet we don't see them. They're hidden. They're veiled, right? It's the world looks at the facade. The world looks at what makes it pretty. The world looks at the outside. And God, he kind of turns everything upside down. Jesus, Moses, they turned everything upside down. They focused on what's important. They focused on the maps. They focused, it was a paradigm shift when I realized that a lot of the work I've been doing as an architect, what I get paid for is just facade. It's not it's what they see every day. But those who have foresight to see beyond that, to see the value of what's really important in life, like the people who do all the the hidden things, like quietly setting up chairs, taking chairs down, people who pray through the week for everyone. It's all those hidden things. That's what's really valuable. That's a paradigm shift. Um, and you know, where I first learned about paradigm shifts was when I visited the Griffith Park Observatory. There's what's called Foucault pendulum. When you get there, it's you see all these dominoes set up around the outside perimeter of the circle. There's like a guard wall, so you can't go into it. So it's a circular guard wall, and all these dominoes are set up on the inside of that guard wall radially, like the seconds of a clock. And then you've got this pendulum that's going back and forth, and it looks like it's going in a circular motion because it's knocking down one domino after the other. And you can look this up on YouTube, or you can look it up on Google, and you can find images and videos of a Foucault pendulum. And the paradigm shift is this, right? You think that this pendulum is going radially, knocking down, swinging back and forth, but it's going like radially and knocking down each of these dominoes. But it's not. When you read the plaque on the wall that explains what's happening, the physics behind it, it's the Earth that's actually rotating. The pendulum is only moving in two directions, like one, like back and forth, back and forth. But since the Earth is rotating, it's knocking down every time it takes a swing. The rotation of the Earth it causes it to knock down the next domino in radially, and that was a major mind blowing paradigm when I read that plaque, because you think that it's moving radially, but it's actually just moving in two directions, back and forth, and that's what it's like reading the Bible for me. And that's what Christianity and Judaism and living a life with God is like. It's one paradigm shift after the other, and it's really cool. It's like what we started with. It goes back to that. It's the trigger effect. It's God being like Morpheus, and you don't take the blue pill and walk away from it. You take the red pill, and he's like showing you just how far this rabbit hole goes. How and your mind is blown away like every day. Every time you study, once the Holy Spirit's guiding you and you're really studying like a paleontologist, your mind will actually get blown away every time. It will actually have purpose. So you won't be shooting like a stormtrooper anymore. You won't be missing everything. When God teaches you how to study, you'll be um, hitting the target, right? You won't be missing the mark. You'll actually be, you won't be like a stormtrooper. You'll be like a marksman. Anyway, all that said, just, that's lesson 4 is open your mind to what God has to show you so that your paradigm can shift and see things from God's point of view, from His world, because His world is not like ours. It's set apart. It's holy, and it's a major shift in your thinking. Anyway, thanks for joining me. Bye. Shalom.